right now we assume that we can stop demand by slowing immigration. And I like to sort of tease people to say, hey, what happened if all of a sudden we experienced another baby boom? And the population started growing domestically because people started having lots of kids. The policy prescription would not be to tell people to slow down the number of kids they're having. It would be to speed up the amount of construction we're doing and speed up the types of housing and the places where we're allowed to build housing. Things that are very much within our control that happen to also have the secondary benefit of driving economic growth and productivity.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director, the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We're back with another edition of Inside Policy, MLI's podcast on domestic policy issues. And it's my great pleasure to be joined by Matt Spoke. Matt is a real estate developer and a former tech entrepreneur in Toronto. Matt spends much of his time thinking about public policy, particularly in fields related to tech, innovation, and economic growth. And he is a big advocate for more ambitious pro-competition policy in Canada to drive the next generation of entrepreneurs and to deliver economic prosperity for the country. Matt is here today to talk to us about housing affordability and supply, all of the complex facets of this issue that is now affecting many people. Matt, great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's dive right into it. You've been in the financial services space for many years where you did some work on real estate and now fully in the real estate sector. How would you describe the nature and extent of the current housing issues we're facing? We'll dive into more of the specific factors later, such as supply, the regulatory environment, foreign speculation, demographics. But how would you summarize the issue in a succinct way, if you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think succinctly, you probably could have seen this happen. They've seen this happening almost 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, for those paying attention, you could plot on a graph quite easily what's happening with our population and what's happening with housing completion. You could add complexity to that by zooming in on specific areas of the country, specific cities and metropolitan areas, but really, really high level. Our population is growing at a certain pace and our housing stock is not growing at that same pace or exceeding it. And so increasingly that is being felt by people in the way of home prices increasing, rents increasing, effectively across the country. Obviously more concentrated in certain areas than others, but that's as simple as it gets.
Very good. So it's an issue that's gotten national attention from time to time. As the markets go through peaks and valleys,
but the services.
It more or less remains a municipal or provincial issue for the most part, because housing issues tend to be concentrated locally. But in recent years, we've really seen this become a national discussion, and the federal government even start to take a more active policy role. So could you start by laying out for us where the different policy responsibilities lie for different aspects of housing policy?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to understand on this file is the relationship between the municipalities and the provinces. And I'll use Ontario as an example, just because I spend most of my time thinking about this in the context of Ontario. But, most people don't necessarily appreciate that municipalities are a creation of provincial jurisdiction. And therefore, anything that is municipal in nature is in reality provincial in nature by default, meaning the province can supersede municipalities in any areas of policy that they disagree with or have a higher level reason to sort of think differently on. I think housing is probably one of these areas where we've seen the most distance between sort of the provincial perspective and the municipal perspective across the country. Municipalities have been entrusted in most parts of the country with land use policy. They get to decide what is allowed to be built and where. Some of it is quite technical and specific in nature. Anybody who's gone through the process of wanting to build a garage in their backyard or extend a deck, may have interacted with municipal planning staff around, hey, what are the permissions of how close to my property line am I allowed to extend a structure, what is the largest lot coverage I'm allowed to, expand my house. These are all sort of governed by the municipalities. I think where we've lost the plot in recent history is that these would have been, land use planning and zoning regulations to allow for a certain amount of control to maintain what municipalities might call the character of neighborhoods. But they were never really intended to be limitations that would impact a city's ability to grow or a region's ability to grow. And now, because of how much growth we've experienced recently in some of our biggest cities in Canada, the pressure of that growth is being felt by municipalities. But in reality, they have no control over how much growth is occurring or where it's going to occur. And so, they're left with these relatively stringent and restrictive land use policies that assume, let's say, moderate or stagnant growth in population during a time when we're seeing, very, very high levels of growth that, to a certain extent, are not even provincial in nature. I mean, you asked the question about where's the federal responsibility in all this. It could probably most simply be framed as immigration and sort of all factors relating to immigration, refugee policy, foreign students, foreign temporary workers, all of, everything within that sort of umbrella. But I do think that probably where most focus needs to be placed on this issue is redrawing the lines between what is municipal in nature and what is provincial in nature, and where should we be calling on our provinces to take back authority on aspects of the housing file from what they would have historically entrusted municipalities to manage themselves. And that's not an easy process because there's a ton of politics in that, of course.
Yes, undoubtedly. Well, we'll come back to that later. But just to dive a little bit deeper into the factors that are influencing this, you alluded to many of them. One we see is the construction industry. They play a role in supply of homes and the types. Then there's your industry, real estate, and the regulatory environment there. You touched on immigration, the volume of immigrants, the type, their concentration in certain areas. And then another one is demographics. We have an aging society, one that will be increasingly supported by a smaller proportional size of working age people. How do some of these factors play into the equation?
Well, at a very high level, and you'll hear this often when people are talking about housing policy, you can boil it all down to factors that impact supply and factors that impact demand for housing. Naturally, there's a lot more detail underneath every one of these policy areas that you mentioned. But if you look at things that restrict our ability to build homes, could be things like land use policy, could be limitations in the availability of labor in the construction industry, could be financing rules that sort of restrict certain types of housing getting built. Up until very recently, it was very uncommon for people to build large-scale rental housing for the last several decades in Canada because financing was just not plausible for that type of development. And these would be restrictive on the types and quantity of housing that are being built across the country. On the demand side, it would be factors not only with population. Population growth is an easy one to point to, immigration being an obvious one, but you mentioned demographics. I mean, demographics impact demand in the sense that different types of families and different ages of people impact the types of housing that they need. Young families versus retirees have a very different need in terms of housing type. And a big challenge in the housing market in Canada is that we're not creating enough, let's say, diversity in housing types. We've created historically, if you look at cities like Toronto and Vancouver, you see this most apparently. We have a lot of historic single-family detached homes or semi-detached homes. And in recent history, we've created a lot of high-rise condominiums. We haven't created much else, so we've created two very distinct housing types, but they don't necessarily meet all of these various demographic requirements. If you're an elderly couple, retired, empty nesters, still living in a 5-bedroom home, you may not want to live in that 5-bedroom home anymore because it's too much for you to manage. It's more real estate than you need, more square footage than you need, but nor do you necessarily want to live on the 40th story of a glass tower downtown Toronto. So where does that demographic shift? Where does that demand shift is also a big part of the conversation that I think has not been getting a ton of attention. That's how I tend to think of it. I'm very, I'd say very strongly of the view that most of this issue is a supply issue. And I say that because I think the market is a way to address some of these demand concerns. Types of housing for different demographics can be resolved by allowing the supply of different types of housing, right? So allowing looser permissions to build walk-up apartment buildings and more townhomes in areas that didn't historically allow for townhomes, and things that are smaller than high rises but bigger than single family homes, what we call the missing middle of housing development. And on the immigration topic, I think is where people get particularly focused, especially in the last year or so, where this has become a really big topic of conversation among every one of our federal political parties as to what should our immigration policy be in light of the recent housing crisis. What I struggle with on that particular lever of policy is that I think it ignores a lot of the benefits of high levels of immigration if well managed. We're an economy that quite heavily depends on immigrants, and I think the next 50 years or so of our country's prosperity could look very differently if we either become much more restrictive on immigration or continue to be permissive. And so then, if you are going to be a country that effectively accepts the fact that our prosperity depends on a certain level of immigration, you then need to look elsewhere to solve this problem. That sort of takes you back to supply. I mean, the other sort of lens that I like to challenge people on is right now we assume that we can stop demand by slowing immigration, and I like to sort of tease people to say, hey, what happened if all of a sudden we experienced another baby boom, and the population started growing domestically because people started having lots of kids? The policy prescription would not be to tell people to slow down the number of kids they're having. It would be to speed up the amount of construction we're doing and speed up the types of housing and the places where we're allowed to build housing. Things that are very much within our control that happen to also have the secondary benefit of driving economic growth and productivity, because these are putting people to work. These are industries where Canada has historically been quite competitive. Our real estate industry is a massive driver of GDP in this country. And I think it's short-sighted to not just look at unlocking that industry to reach its full potential, as opposed to looking to slow down the demands for the product that we're really good at building.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Tweaking around the margins, the levels, and the ability to integrate, which are certainly issues with respect to immigration. We're hopefully going to see another baby boom, as many young people have expressed desire and wanting to have larger families. When it comes to the supply, then, can you talk a little bit more about what barriers, if you would characterize them that way, the construction industry is facing in this regard, the real estate industry, whether it is things like the provincial building code and fire code, and or to what extent it is things like local land use policies, zoning, permitting processes, these sorts of things?
Well, maybe I'll take those one at a time. So on construction, I won't profess to have a ton of depth here, but I will say that what's very obvious interfacing with the construction industry when you're a real estate developer is that it is a very, very there's very slim room for competition in the construction industry. And so part of it is the nature of the industry is very heavily unionized. And as a result, it's very difficult for new entrants to enter into that market and offer competition. Let's say, very commonly in large cities in Canada, we build high-rise towers in concrete. Concrete formwork is a very high demand trade. These are the companies that effectively pour concrete into the floors and structures that create our high-rise towers. And it is nearly impossible to launch a new concrete formwork company in markets like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, for one, because of how much control the local unions have on these industries. And that creates an enormous amount of competitive pressure that drives prices up. So in boom cycles where prices are going up and condos are sort of flying off the shelves and interest rates are low, like we experienced in the last 10 years up until recent interest rate hikes, you're just a price taker. There is no room to negotiate pricing on concrete formwork. It costs what it costs. And if you were entrepreneurial enough to say, hey, there's room here for another competitor to enter this market, you'd be blocked very quickly by the local unions from doing that. And so I do think there is something to be said about reviewing our construction industry through the lens of competition or anti-competitive practices. But I know that it's a very touchy political ground because of the heavy presence of unions in that space. So the other thing I'll say is that, construction tends to be very specialized within a particular type of built form. And when I say built form, I mean, the difference between high rise and single family homes is very different trades that specialize in these different types of built form, different construction companies that build different things. The more we restrict the types of housing we're allowed to build, the more we limit the ability for a competitive construction industry. Because if we were allowed to build more missing middle type housing, you'd probably see more competition in those new segments of the market, because the types of companies on the construction side that would build a 4 to 6 story walk-up apartment building would not be the same trades as those building high-rise towers downtown Toronto. And so, there's a higher probability that they may not be unionized, or even if they were, they're not necessarily butting heads with those that are building, class 10 condos in our city cores. And so I think allowing for more permissive land uses also creates an environment for more competition in the construction industry, which is going to be net positive. Because, if I'm looking at a site, let's say a piece of land in a suburban city around Toronto, and I have the ability to either push very aggressive density to build a high rise, but I know that my cost to construct are going to be extremely expensive because of the sort of anti-competitive nature of the construction industry, or I can build mid-rise on that same site and I can get construction costs per square foot to a much more reasonable level, I might opt to build mid-rise. And that might put competitive pressure on the high-rise trades to sort of bring the prices down. And so I think all of this sort of points to the more competition in construction, the better. The one thing I will say on construction that I have not directly seen evidence of, and that I don't necessarily subscribe to as a view, is that we have a massive labor shortage. I mean, there are definitely labor shortages in certain types of trades, but across the board, I'm of the view that if we permitted this industry to grow, we would find solutions to the labor shortage. We would start to target skilled trades in our immigration funnels. We would start training more people into these trades, and the labor would show up. Naturally, there might be a lag, between the demand happening and the supply of labor, but I do think that's a solvable problem and should not be seen as like a meaningful constraint on why we're not building. I'd say if you were asking most real estate developers, the primary reasons they're not building, or they're not building enough, is a combination of land use policy and government fees and taxes, effectively, things that directly impact what can I build and how much will it cost me to build. I think you've probably seen this. There's lots of statistics that sort of roll around on, how the costs of a typical development are split between construction costs, land costs, what we call soft costs, the costs associated with designing and engineering a building, and then a pretty significant bucket being government charges and taxes and fees, which in some cases can be up to about 30% of the cost of the development. All of which has to get passed on to the final selling price. And if there's no market to clear that property at that price, then you may as well just not build. So very tangibly today, if you look at the Toronto market, where I spend most of my time, you won't find condominium developers willing to start towers if they don't think they can get $1,250 to $1,300 a square foot in the sale of a condo to the end user, to the buyer of that condo. The reality is, in that $1,250 a square foot, 25 to 30% of that is government fees and taxes. So if there's no buyer at $1,250 a square foot, if you do the simple math, if you're buying a 1,000 square foot condo, that would be a $1.25 million condo. If there's no buyer at that price, there might be a buyer at $1.1 million, which would require that the cost to construct go down by $150,000. Construction, as I mentioned, is relatively stable cost structure. There's not a lot of room for competition right now. The one place that would be a very easy stroke of the pen in terms of policy would be to reduce charges and fees and taxes on new housing construction. And you could see a direct reduction in cost being passed on to homeowners that would translate to more construction getting off the ground. There's been a very significant lull of new developments launching in the last 24 months or so. So I'll pause there. I think you had a few other points on the question.
No, that's very good. And you just kind of paint the picture of this web of what accumulates to be, just a morass of regulations here. And I think because we're still facing the issue, you hear all of these different things come up at various points in time, right, as being factors that affect situation, and people are naturally looking for easy solutions or the silver bullet or what have you.
Yeah.
And some of these things lie with provinces. Some are competitiveness within industries. But at the end of the day, many of the specific factors are at the municipal level. Now, there are political reasons why, many of these things can't be addressed. But do you see a few key things that could be done to kind of cut through the stasis or inability to deal with some of these issues?
Yeah, I think the most obvious and seemingly the most controversial when you ask municipal politicians is development charges. For those who are not so familiar with the housing industry, development charges are a one-time tax charged by municipalities when new housing units are approved for development in a city. And so, let's say you're building a 200-unit tower, condominium, or rental, doesn't really matter. There's a development charge applied to every unit of new housing being introduced into that market, to the tune of like $40,000 to $80,000 per unit being charged by the municipality. I think what's most surprising to people is the fact that those charges are a very new phenomenon. The municipalities use they use the justification. They call it growth pays for growth. Hey, if we're going to allow for new people to enter into our city, we need to pay for infrastructure. We need to expand sewage capacity, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore we need to charge these development charges in order to afford the improvements to our infrastructure to support this new population increase. The reality is, up until about 10 years ago, development charges were a very immaterial cost in the development of housing. And I think if you were asking a municipal politician, why is it that 10 years ago we could build infrastructure without development charges where they are today, and now all of a sudden we can't? What's changed? And the reality of what's changed is it's very easy to point the finger at developers as being sort of the greedy profit takers in this equation, and so it looks like almost it's a no consequence tax that you can pass on an industry without end consumers seeing it directly. You're effectively taxing the creation of new housing, but you're not charging the consumer, you're charging the builder. Reality is the builder's passing that cost on to the consumer, but the consumer doesn't know who's responsible for that. The consumer sees the price and says, developers are greedy and housing is expensive, and that's why it costs me $1 million to get into a tiny condo. And so it's a clever way by municipal politicians to create a new tax source without facing the consequence of voters who don't understand that they're being taxed by municipalities. In the last 10 years in the city of Toronto, development charges have gone up 1,000%, over 10x in 10 years. That we were building high rises and infrastructure downtown Toronto long before 10 years ago. And what should be paying for that is the fact that as you introduce new units into a city, you're creating a new property tax base. You're creating a tax base that's going to pay for ongoing maintenance and construction of infrastructure for decades to come, because now every owner in a condominium building combined is paying more property taxes on that property than what was previously a parking lot before that condominium building got developed, right? So some of this is a timing question of, hey, I'm going to earn property taxes over the life of this development, the life of this property, let's say over 50 or 80 or 100 years, versus the ability to charge a development fee up front. And so I think, there's folks smarter than I that have talked about the ability for municipalities sort of defer, effectively capital costs to match the timing of property taxes being generated off of these new developments over time. But I think the reality is that if you weren't going to introduce increases to development charges, you would have to increase property taxes. But increasing property taxes loses elections. And so, there's not many mayoral candidates that want to run on the idea of increasing property taxes from, to save developers money, let's say. That's how it would be framed by their opponents, at least, right? So it's easier to try to leave the property taxes where they are, and sort of sneak in a hidden tax behind the scenes in the form of development charges. On their own, as I mentioned, we have a number of developments in Toronto, some of which we're paying up over $80,000 per unit to create new housing for the city of Toronto, in a city where, every $100,000 increment cuts an enormous percentage of people out of the market.
So I want to come back to, we've been talking a lot about the missing middle here, which I think
Right.
is fair to say, this is the kind of type of housing we've mostly been talking about, but part of the supply issue, where you see its ramifications in demand for this type of housing, is the lack of affordable housing, I guess you could call it. Um, there are some public safety issues associated with homelessness and these sorts of things. And there's a question about, well, what is the appropriate amount of supply for maybe non-market rate housing? And one factor I want to get your take on as well is rent control. How
Right.
do you see, rent control policies locally and provincially across Canada, and how is it affecting supply? So that's one. And then this supply of social housing. Are we thinking about this the right way? What effect does it have on the overall housing supply and affordability issue? Should these programs be expanded or modified? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So on rent controls, I'll say the province of Ontario eliminated rent controls in 2018. There are still a few jurisdictions in Canada that still maintain rent controls. Typically, that means a landlord is restricted from increasing the rent more than a fixed percentage on an annual basis, often in or around the range of 2%. So, I think these policies tend to try to target inflation or something near it, but it's sometimes a little bit more complex than that. But let's say, for argument's sake, 2% per year as a cap. The challenge over the last several decades is that the market price of rent has been increasing at a rate faster than 2% a year. And so what that's effectively done is it's killed the incentive for developers to create new rental stock. Because as you sort of forecast owning a building for 50 years, there's a big difference if you're capped at increasing rents 2% a year versus 3% or 4% a year, depending on what the market for rent is doing. Counterintuitively, rent controls have been quite heavily studied, and the conclusions often very, very commonly point to the same thing. They're the single largest cause of unaffordable rents in markets. And I'd say most people that advocate for rent controls have a hard time understanding sort of the indirect consequences of economic policy. The direct consequence of rent controls is if I live in a unit today that costs me $2,000, next year my landlord will only be able to increase it by 2%. That sounds great because I don't want them to increase it by 5% because I'm a tenant, and that's phenomenal. The indirect consequence is that landlord is a lot less likely to build more rental units in my city. And the market for available rental units is going to significantly go down. The number one determinant of rents being unaffordable is, I'd say not determinant. Strongest correlation of rents being unaffordable is the low rate of vacancy. The lower the vacancy rate, the less choice tenants have to seek an alternative, right? My landlord is charging me too much, but I can go across the street and I can get a lower rent. That competitive pressure forces landlords to maintain reasonable market rent. I think the fallacy is that if you eliminate rent controls, landlords go out of control and they start increasing rents by 10, 20% a year because landlords are just greedy slumlords, right? And the reality is that that's not how markets work. Markets work in the sense that there is an efficiency to the fact that if your landlord wants to increase your rent by 10%, lucky you, there's other landlords out there that are smart enough to underprice that landlord and capture their customer base, right? So the market maintains a natural cap to what that rent increase is going to be. That being said, in cities like Toronto, we've seen 5 to 7% rental increases over the last decade or so. Not because, and I'll say let's exclude the fact that the policy changed in 2018, because rents still increase when people move out of units. Then those units are allowed to be repriced at market rent. So you still see rents go up higher than rent control as like an average number. But those rents are going up at those rates, again, not because of greedy landlords, but because of a low vacancy rate and a low supply of rental housing, right? So if we were to increase our vacancy rate, which today is still sub 2%, often close to 1% vacancy rates, if you bring that vacancy rate back up to 2 to 3 to 4%, all of a sudden you start to see rents significantly slow down in their growth. In terms of and actually, before I move on to your second question on social housing, I'll say that there was a study done relatively recently that I'd be happy to forward your way, in the U.S. that sort of focused on rent increases or rent changes, either increase or decrease in key American markets, and correlating that to their policies on land use effectively. The more permissive these cities were, or the more restrictive they were, in correlation to rent prices across these municipalities. And the study very, very clearly showed that the markets that were building more than the average per capita housing were the ones seeing either reductions or significant slowdowns in the rate of rent increases. So cities like Austin that have seen like a significant reduction in their rental rates. There are very good examples for us to point to not too far away, cities that feel very much like Canadian cities where they're seeing rents stop increasing or in fact decrease as a result of land use policy becoming more permissive. So I think it's worth studying those more closely and realizing that there's some obvious solutions in there. On social housing, or let's say non-market housing, the types of things that governments might have historically built, I think there's always going to be a need. I think there's questions about what's the best way to fulfill that need. Is, governments today are significantly less efficient at building and delivering infrastructure as they might have been 30, 40 years ago, particularly North American governments. If we just talk at a very high level of just state capacity, our ability to build transit lines and highway infrastructure and anything of substance, we're really bad at building as governments. So I think there's a very valid question as to who should be building non-market rate housing. If the goal is to provide a form of housing to people that are going to be sort of fall beneath the basic sort of affordability threshold, but the market should really be trying to reduce what that number is, right? So let's say today there are 20 or 30% of people in Toronto that can't afford a quote unquote affordable rent as defined by CMHC data or whatever the case might be. One view would be, okay, we have to provide social housing for 20 or 30% of renters in the city of Toronto. Another view would be we need to right size our housing market such that number of 20, 30% reduces to 5%, 8% over the course of the next 20 years. And because I think there will always be a percentage of people that sort of fall through the cracks, and we want to build a caring and relatively compassionate society. So I think there's always going to be a need for that. But accepting that it's going to be a very large percentage of people is effectively just accepting a market inefficiency that we haven't resolved yet.
Very good. Well, we've touched on many factors here, and there are truly many different policy proposals and levers that could be pulled. But of course, the biggest challenge here is a balancing, competing priorities and preferences and dealing with the reality of politics, right? So some of the more qualitative sides of housing, we've already spoken a little bit about people having different preferences when it comes to location and housing type. This is certainly a factor in the equation. Everyone wants more housing, but of course they don't want it in their backyard. And, some people really like, the urban lifestyle. Others, want to be kind of as far away as reasonably possible from an urban environment, and vice versa, right? So people's, I think when we look at some of the solutions here, I'll put them in air quotes because there are many, but some that you hear the most often, like higher density housing, more high rises, these sorts of things, they're the cheapest, they're the most logistically feasible for a host of reasons. But then, recognizing some of these other things, there's perhaps a lot of factors militating against them as well. So a broad question, but how do policymakers approach this issue of balancing competing interests in this space and try to kind of cut the Gordian knot here?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure I've got a complete answer on this. I will say that I find we spend too much time and I say let's say politicians and policymakers and regulators spend a lot of time, and in the context of housing, let's add to that list planners. They spend a lot of time thinking about people's preferences and trying to account for people's preferences in policy. land use policy is a great example of that. People want to live in single family homes, so let's restrict the use of this land to single family homes. I mean, I think what gets missed in that framing is that the preferences are revealed in market prices, right? If people had a preference for one type of product over another, they'd be willing to pay more for that type of product versus the other. And I think a lot of this has to do with significantly, I don't think there's a solution to this crisis that is tweaking on the edges. I think there's a significant amount of reform that's needed for this to be right-sized. And I don't think that we should be looking to government to effectively prescribe what people want or what they don't want. If people want high rises, they will line up to buy them, and there will be a market for people to build them. If people want suburban subdivisions, there'll be a market for people to buy those, and there'll be builders to build those. And I think there will be people in bucket A and people in bucket B, and there'll be 20 other buckets of different types of housing product determined by demand. Right now, what happens is that we don't allow demand to determine these decisions. We restrict the ability to do things. And it's not always high-rise density that we're restricting. We also restrict urban boundary expansion. We restrict development of the green belts. The types of people that don't want to see the green belt touched are the same people that don't want to see density approved downtown. And the question has to be, well, where do you want people to live, right? If it's not going to be a new expansion to Milton or to Brantford, and it's also not going to be more towers in the core, then where are we going to put this housing, and how are we going to sort of support this growing population? And I think the wrong answer from my perspective is let's just stop population growth at all costs, because I think that has so many other negative consequences that we just don't want to face as a country. Mm-hmm. So there tends to be, people want to have their cake and eat it too. Like I want to be NIMBY in the sense that I live in Toronto and I don't want density in my neighborhood, but I also want to be seen as environmentalist. And so I don't want greenbelt sprawl, and I don't want to see new subdivisions getting built outside of the city. And I hate Highway 413 expansion. And these things are in contradiction to each other, but we never really frame it that way. And so, I do think that we should be allowing both sprawl and tall. And I think we should be allowing the market to decide where they put their dollars, right? And if a dollar goes towards, I want to buy a house in the suburbs, as opposed to going towards buying a high-rise downtown, then I think, those preferences will be revealed in the market. And developers and entrepreneurs will sort of shift to satisfy that demand.
Very good, Matt. Final question for you to leave us with your thoughts on the most effective proposals. One thing stood out to me, though, from this discussion. You mentioned so much of the policy gets determined at the provincial, but more importantly, municipal level, and municipalities are creatures of the province. So to cut through some of the unwillingness, for lack of a better word, to act on some of these issues, is there a role for provinces here to be a little more prescriptive with respect to policy choices? And in summary, what are the major, most effective policy approaches that you recommend policymakers take?
Yeah, so the answer to your first question from my perspective is absolutely. I mean, I think the big frustration that folks that follow this topic in Ontario particularly have has been a relative inaction from the Ford government to exert any amount of authority over the municipalities on this file, for fear of ruffling feathers and sort of creating political enemies. And I think that's led to a lot of the challenges. I mean, and some will frame this as sort of democracy at the most local level, sort of having its way. If you follow both municipal elections, but also even more day-to-day local versions of democracy, like community consultations and town halls and things that people engage with to have their opinions voiced on housing developments particularly, I think what you realize is it's not really a representative version of democracy. What happens is there's a very small and vocal minority of people that are the types of people that show up and vote in municipal elections, because we have very low voter turnouts in municipal elections, and are the types of people that show up and voice their disapproval or their opposition to developments at community town halls and consultations and things like that. And so that vocal minority carries an enormous amount of weight in terms of how municipalities look at this issue, because city councilors are motivated by their electoral prospects, right? And if the people voting for them are existing elderly homeowners who don't want density in their neighborhood, they're going to bend in that direction. The reality is that younger would-be homeowners that don't yet live in that neighborhood don't have a vote for that city councilor because they don't live there yet, right? So there definitely seems to be a mismatch between sort of the incentives of the electoral or the democratic system at the very local level, and the changes that are happening to our province. I mean, the province definitely has a better view if you zoom out to where is the province going to change, where our population's going to settle. Not that they have a perfect lens, but they have a slightly better perspective from their vantage point to say, hey, we know that Toronto is going to continue growing, and the cities surrounding it are going to continue growing, and we should be prescribing a certain amount of growth to our municipalities as a result of that. I think they've failed to do that to a large extent. There are examples of provinces that say, and I always hesitate to make this example because for many other reasons, I'm not a big fan of the BC NDP party, but I find the BC NDP has been a slightly better example of a province sort of exerting a little bit more authority on the housing file with municipalities that have historically not wanted to be very permissive. So, we could have a province that takes control over documents like the official plan that govern land use policy in their municipalities. And dictate certain changes to these official plans. We in Ontario don't have a province that is willing to do that right now.
Well, thanks so much, Matt. You've given us much to think about, and here's to hoping some of these proposals will get the uptake that is much needed. So I'm Peter Copeland for Inside Policy. Thanks so much, Matt, for joining us.
Thanks, Peter.